It feels like every day now, all we hear in America is how China is supposed to be our biggest enemy. Politicians, big media outlets, even some so-called experts, everyone seems to be on the same page, shouting about how China is this big, evil country that we all should be afraid of. You've got people talking about trade wars, spying, hacking, military threats. It's like there's this huge effort to make China out to be this villain that's lurking in the shadows, ready to ruin our lives. And let's be real, most people just go along with it because that's all they hear. They don't stop to think or question if it's actually true. But thankfully, there are still some intelligent, reasonable voices out there who don't buy into all of this anti-China hysteria. People like Professor Jeffrey Sachs, for example. Jeffrey Sachs is an economist and a university professor who's been around for decades working on global issues. People like him are saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe this whole China is the enemy narrative is more about politics and power than it is about actual facts. And in these next few clips, you'll see Professor Jeffrey Sachs lay it all out, exposing the truth about China and why the hostility and ignorance coming from so many Americans is misguided.
I feel the United States learned, sitting on Britain's knee, everything we know about empire we learned from Britain. And there was almost a handover of the baton from Britain to the United States, from Churchill, basically to Truman, I would say, at the end of World War II. And the megalomania took a big jump in the United States. Dean Acheson, one of our top diplomats, wrote his memoirs called Present at the Creation. Okay, well, it's a little bit of the mindset, the creation. This was, of course, what it meant was the beginning of the American-led world. Quantitatively, the U.S. absolutely is different and absolutely has a foreign policy that is different from all other countries. What other country has 750 overseas military bases?
Well, why did they put their countries next to the U.S. bases?
That's exactly right. You know, you look at that map of China surrounded by the U.S. military bases with that question coming out of the map. The military bases are everywhere. That's distinctive. The country number 2, by the way, of most military bases to this day, it's not China or Russia, these big populous countries, it's Britain.
If you watch the news, you've probably heard the same story over and over again. Russia and China are the bad guys, threatening world peace and stability. The media hammers this point home so often that it feels like common sense. But if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, it's hard to ignore the truth. America and its NATO allies are the real cause of much of the chaos and instability we see around the world. The United States and NATO have a long history of going into other countries, causing havoc, and then leaving things worse than they were before. They justify it by calling themselves the defenders of democracy or protectors of peace, but their actions tell a different story. Time and again, they've shown that their main priority is maintaining power and control, even if it means destabilizing entire regions. Take the Middle East, for example. The U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, claiming Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It turned out to be a lie, but by the time the truth came out, Iraq was already destroyed. The war killed hundreds of thousands of people, tore apart the country's infrastructure, and left behind a power vacuum that gave rise to extremist and terrorist groups. Even today, Iraq is still struggling to recover, and the effects of this invasion continue to ripple across the entire Middle East. Libya is another glaring example. In 2011, NATO intervened, claiming they wanted to protect civilians from Muammar Gaddafi, and what happened after they toppled Gaddafi? Libya fell into chaos, with militias, human trafficking, and lawlessness taking over the country. The country became a failed state, and the people who were supposed to be saved by NATO ended up worse than they were before. The chaos isn't limited to the Middle East. In Eastern Europe, the US and NATO have been provoking Russia for years. After the Cold War ended, they promised to not expand NATO towards Russia's borders, and they broke that promise. Over the years, they've added several countries from Eastern Europe into NATO, bringing their military alliance closer and closer to Russia. In Asia, the United States plays a similar game with China. It surrounds China with military bases and constantly sends warships through the South China Sea under the excuse of freedom of navigation. These actions are blatant provocations designed to pressure China and remind the world who's the boss. The result is rising tensions that could easily spiral into a larger conflict, and what makes it even worse is that the hypocrisy is the US loves to lecture other countries about human rights, democracy, and international law, but it routinely breaks these same rules. It invades countries without UN approval, backs authoritarian regimes when it suits their interests, and ignores human rights abuses committed by allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel. Yet the media barely talks about this, rather focusing on places like Xinjiang in China. So yeah, Jeffrey Sachs is absolutely right to talk about how, in fact, we're the biggest bullies and not the Chinese. It doesn't mean that they're innocent, but we're definitely not better.
Why does it seem as if you're willing to take the justifications of Putin vis-a-vis Ukraine? Of
because
China,
I know what
China and Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, of Bashar al-Assad saying he's fighting terrorism while he's barrel bombing Syrian people. Why are you so partial to their justification but not Netanyahu's?
First of all, because I know that most of these things like Xinjiang is Western blah, 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 blah narrative.
But what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that there are tens of thousands of people being slaughtered in Gaza, and there is not even one story about murders in Xinjiang.
But you'd accept some bad things are happening.
It could be bad things, but to call that a genocide and to be making an actual genocide in Gaza is a game of Western narratives.
So to really get where all these stories about genocide in Xinjiang are coming from, we've got to look at who's pushing them. Most of this started making waves in Western media around 2018, and a lot of it ties back to just a few sketchy sources. One of the key players here is a guy named Adrian Zenz. He's not just any researcher, he's openly said he's a Christian fundamentalist on a mission from God to take on China. So that's not exactly the most neutral stance, right? He's put out a bunch of reports claiming there's forced labor, sterilization, and mass internment going on in Xinjiang, but his work has been torn apart by experts for being sloppy and based on cherry-picked, unreliable data. A lot of these testimonies, a lot of these claims from people who claim to have been to these camps usually are connected to anti-China activist groups. And they're even, some of them are even funded by Western governments. So when you dig into their stories, they often fall apart. The timing is also super convenient. China's been rising as this global powerhouse, both economically and politically. And the US doesn't like that. Painting China as a human rights abuser gives them a way to justify all kinds of aggressive actions towards China, like sanctions, military buildup in Asia, you name it. It's all about maintaining control on the world stage. So when you look at the big picture, it's hard not to see this as a part of a broader strategy to take down a rival. This is not to say that Xinjiang has no issues. Like any country, China faces challenges managing its diverse population, and there could be human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Absolutely. But while the U.S. loudly accuses China of these crimes in Xinjiang, the U.S. remains silent or worse, complicit in real human rights abuses elsewhere. Nowhere is this hypocrisy clearer than its unwavering support for Israel's occupation of Palestine. For decades, Israel has carried out policies that amount to systemic oppression of Palestinians, and the U.S. has not only turned a blind eye, but has actively funded and armed these actions. Israel's treatment of Palestinians includes practices that are a clear violation of international law. Palestinians in the occupied territories face forced evictions, land seizures, and the destruction of their homes. The Israeli government continues to expand illegal settlements on Palestinian land, effectively annexing more and more territory while denying Palestinians basic rights. These actions are not isolated incidents. They're part of a larger strategy to break Palestinian resistance and maintain control over the region. And what is the U.S. doing while all of this is happening? It's sending billions and billions of dollars in military aid to Israel every year. These funds directly support the weapons, the tanks, the fighter jets used to enforce this occupation and to carry out airstrikes. The U.S. also shields Israel from any accountability on the global stage. When the United Nations try to condemn Israel's actions, the U.S. vetoes these resolutions. This isn't just passive support, it's active complicity.
You take our current story in the United States of China, the war like China. How many wars has China been in the last 40 years? Let me count them. That would be 0. Not one war in 40 years. When was the most recent war that China was in? January 16 to February 16, 1979. 1 month in a conflict with Vietnam, which had to do actually with Vietnam having overthrown a government in Cambodia. Okay, 1 month. We are not at dire risk from China. China is not mass murdering its population, but we are gearing up in the United States for war with China. Why? Well, once again, people actually wrote why. You have to know where to look, but if you look at the Council on Foreign Relations, an article by a former colleague of mine, Robert Blackwell and Ashley Tellis, in 2015, they say that China has become so powerful that it threatens American primacy. And China's rise is no longer in America's interest.
For decades, the United States and China maintained a relatively stable relationship. In the 1970s, the two nations forged partnerships in trade, diplomacy, and global problem solving. Both sides benefited from this cooperation. China gained access to global markets and capital, while the U.S. profited from cheaper goods and a growing consumer base in China. Yet, in recent years, that cooperation has shifted dramatically. The U.S. political establishment has turned China into a primary adversary, portraying it as a threat to American economic prosperity, the American military, cultural dominance. This change didn't happen because China became more aggressive. It happened because the U.S. realized that China's rise might soon outpace its own. Despite the aggressive rhetoric coming from Washington, China's actions don't align with the image of a hostile superpower. Its foreign policy is largely focused on economic development and regional stability, not military conquest. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is often framed as a nefarious scheme for global domination. In reality, it's an infrastructure development project aimed at building trade networks and fostering economic growth. And while it's absolutely true that some of these projects have been criticized for creating debt risks, the initiative has also provided vital infrastructure to countries that were previously rejected by Western powers, especially in Africa. That's why if you speak to people in these countries and that are getting help from China, they view China and the Chinese positively because the West comes to Africa and tells Africans how to live, how to run their countries, and extracts their resources and leaves. China comes to these countries to offer economic and infrastructure support to help these countries grow. China, of course, does this for geopolitical reasons, to gain support from other countries, of course, but the way China carries this out is much better than the Americans or the West. So anyways, guys, let me know what you think. Do you disagree with me? Do you agree with me? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you're going to like this one here or this one here. I'll see you guys later. Peace out. Bye-bye.